the type of athlete that's always getting injured and wondering, is this ever going to end? Well, this video is for you. All right, welcome back again to another episode. I am your host, Matt Powers, and we have another special guest. I feel like we're going to be doing a special guest with every video around here, but we have a really special one today. This video is going to be very, very important for you people out there who are always getting injured, which seems like every athlete to this point, you know. So we have a special guest today, Mr. Jon Hereth, who is a physical therapist here locally here in Lee Summit. He is a physical therapist assistant at Summit Rehab. Jon, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it. Why don't you tell us a little about who you are and what makes you qualified to talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a physical therapist assistant for 10 years.
Whew, that's like a decade.
I know, I feel it. I help run and manage a local outpatient orthopedic company called Summit Rehab. We treat all sorts of orthopedic issues. I deal a ton with athletes, particularly barbell and strength athletes. And one of the reasons for that is I have competed in strength athletics for the last 8 years. I spent 3 or 4 years competing in strongman at the national level, and then I just retired in January from competing in the Highland Games.
Oh, tired. So you must be getting a big pension now.
Right, yep, because you know those Highland Game athletes.
Yeah, I see them all the time. They're rolling deep. You know?
Actually, there was just a Highland Game show on ESPN Ocho, just last night.
Ocho?
It was on at 2:30 in the morning. So
I can't tell you the last time I've watched ESPN.
So I just retired from that. I threw at a pretty competitive level. I got to travel quite a bit. I was perennially one of the top amateur athletes in the country. So
where'd you get to travel for doing strongman and Highland Games, stuff like that?
I've traveled all over the United States doing especially Highland Games. But actually, I went to Iceland last year, and I went to try the Husfeldt stone. So
what is this stone? This thing is kind of like ground mythical status around here, you know? Explain this thing to the novice person who has no idea what it is.
So the Husfeldt stone was back in Viking lore. It was a stone that a pastor had to guard his sheep pen, and it became a feat of strength with the local people there if you could pick it up and carry it all the way around the sheep pen.
And what does this thing weigh?
409 pounds. And it's a very awkward,
is it like a triangle kind of shaped or something?
Yeah, and it's about that tall, super slick stone. If you were able to do it, you earned the title of fullstyrker, which in Icelandic means full man.
Thanks for strong people that come out of there, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
We got to get on whatever they're doing, you know. They figured out this whole strongman thing.
All the lobster soup they eat up there.
Is that what it is?
Which is delicious.
Oh, well, you're right there in the sea. I mean, yeah. Wow, it's got to be, you know.
Yeah.
All right. So what became you, like, why become a physical therapist? What did you want to get into this business for?
So when I was doing sports performance training when I was young, and I decided to get into PTA school because I was getting hurt a lot. I have torn and ruptured both my ACLs. So a lot of it was going through that rehab process that kind of drove me into being able to connect what I love to do as an athlete and something I could do professionally to help people. Right. And in the meantime, a lot of these injuries have been a learning process. I have herniated discs. I've fractured my low back. I've ruptured my biceps. I've torn labrums in my shoulder. I've done a lot of it, and it's I'm not necessarily proud of that fact, but it's been a learning process, and because of that, I've still always driven to get back into competing at a high level.
Well, I mean, after you have an injury, I think it puts you in the perspective of the customer, you know.
Yeah.
And we're not only coming from a physical pain, but also a mental pain too, you know, of not being able to do the workouts that they want, or having physical pain, sleeping, walking, all that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah. And pain can be debilitating for people.
Wow, that's why we have a drug epidemic. What do you think? All right, so we're going to talk about a couple different things here, and then we're going to get right into it here. First off, we'll talk about why athletes get hurt, and then we're going to talk about a little bit how to minimize injury, and then we'll kind of summarize everything for everybody and give you some takeaways that you guys can use to improve your fitness level. So first off, Jon, let's talk about why athletes get hurt in the first place.
Yeah, so I want to preface that even with, if you're an athlete and you plan on competing in a sport for an extended period of time, you're going to get hurt.
100%.
We can do our best to minimize risk for injury, but at some point you're probably going to get hurt. And we get hurt because orthopedic injuries, so that's what I'm referring to when I talk about injuries as orthopedic injuries. They happen when tissues cannot absorb and adapt to the stress or the load that's being put on them. You're going to hear me say that a lot. When tissues can't absorb and adapt to that stress, they fail. And so what we want to look at is how can we minimize tissue failure by absorbing and adapting to stress. What we can take away from that is when we increase load or if we increase stress, it doesn't matter if you're putting weight on a barbell, right? It doesn't matter if you're increasing mileage, okay? Even if we're dealing with the layperson, right? And all of a sudden they have a new job where it requires them to stand on their feet for 5 more hours a day, right? We have to ask ourselves, if we're going to increase load or increase stress, what can we do to increase our ability and capability to manage that stress and adapt to that stress? If we don't do that, what's going to happen is we're going to get hurt or our tissues are going to fail.
You get those muscle tears and strains and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so when we're looking at how can I best absorb and adapt to stress, there's 2 components that build into that. First is capacity, movement capacity. I often explain this in terms of a fitness analogy. I tell people, if you wanted to go run a marathon, you wouldn't just pick up and go run a marathon. Most people wouldn't.
It's a bad idea,
right?
It's a bad idea to run a marathon, first class, right?
You can look at me. I don't run marathons. I've been trying to suck my
I think there should be a limit. If you're over 200 pounds, your marathon is like 5 miles.
But what you do is you'd get up and you'd start walking. You'd start running 5Ks, right? Assuming that while you'd run 10Ks, you'd run half marathons, or you'd build capacity.
So we're building up that so the body can get used to a certain level of stress, and then this next to another level.
Right.
Of stress.
What we're doing is we're building our ability to absorb and adapt to stress.
Makes sense.
Movement capacity is a huge component, right? And that's a huge component of why people get hurt. CrossFit, for example, typically has a reputation for getting people hurt.
So is that because somebody comes in, maybe they haven't been doing fitness for a while, and they come into a CrossFit class and they see their buddy who's doing X amount of weight or going as fast as he can, and they want to keep up with him, and all of a sudden, boom, hey, injury happens because their body hasn't been able to absorb that stress there. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they've exceeded their capacity, and it doesn't matter. You can move perfectly. If you exceed your capacity, chances are you're going to get hurt.
So how do we increase that capacity? Is that just slow over time, or what's the best way to do that?
Man, it's super multifaceted. They're obviously planning your training appropriately is a great way to improve your capacity. Making sure you eat well, making sure you sleep well. Sometimes supplements or drugs that people are on can have a positive and or negative effect on their capacity. One of the other big components that we look at, though, to help people's capacity is improving their movement quality, right? And so it's been going around like lately that there's no such thing as good posture, good technique, bad technique.
Who says
right?
that?
A lot of people say that, and there's some merit to that, because you can build capacity in any position that you're in.
True.
If I'm if I'm texting all the time, I'm in this head forward.
You can stay like that for a long time.
Yeah, I can build capacity here, and I can build tolerance to that. But I'm probably not going to have as much capacity if I'm in more of what we would call a neutral posture or a less provocative posture.
And why would that be?
Because there are positions that we can absorb and adapt to stress better. And that's what we're going to get into with movement quality, right? When we train, when we live, when we pick stuff up, when we go for a run, there are positions that we absorb and adapt to stress better. And so then the idea becomes, if I can absorb and adapt to stress better because my movement quality is high, then I can maybe venture into and build my capacity in those positions. I can venture into non-optimal loading strategies because I have a higher capacity and my risk for injury goes down.
Right. That makes sense. So let's go into this, how do we minimize injuries? You talked about it. Every athlete at some point is going to get injured to some extent. It's just, if you're working out a lot, that's how it's going to be. It's a myth to say that you're never going to have some sort of of something that's going to keep you from doing a certain workout at some point, But how do we best minimize that injury risk?
Okay, so what I do in the rehab field is I venture into mostly movement quality, right? I hope that typically the strength and conditioning coaches, the people writing the programming, the nutritionists, they're dealing with capacity, right? I deal with capacity a little bit, but I try to really venture into movement quality and how can I best help people's quality improve so then they can build a robust capacity. Right. You with me? Does that make sense? And so two of the things I really look at when we're building movement quality is, does the joint do what it's supposed to do? Or does each individual joint absorb and adapt to stress the way it should? There's two things we need to look at when we look at that. First is the mobility of the joint, and second is the stability of the joint. We bring Nick in, right? If you look for definitions of mobility and stability and you Google it, you'll find 9 million different definitions.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty straightforward.
There's lots of ways to interpret that. But one of the definitions I like best was actually defined by a guy named Charlie Weingroff. He's a PT out in the East Coast, super PT, and he's really, really influenced how I think and how I treat. He defines mobility as the nervous system, so the brain, control of an uninfluenced joint, right? So that includes, how much passive range of motion do we have in a joint? I don't know if you can see this on the camera, right? But if we look at Nick's elbow joint here, right? I can take his elbow from full extension all the way into full flexion. That's passive range of motion. I'm doing all the work. Right. That's a mobile joint, right? But a mobile joint is also how much active range of motion do we have, right? Can he take his elbow all the way from extension into full flexion, right? Also a mobile joint. Nervous system's control on an uninfluenced joint. That's a mobile joint. So that's thing one that we look at. The second thing we look at is stability, and Charlie defines stability as the nervous system's control in the presence of change. We tend to think of stability as not moving at all, right? And that's one aspect of stability. If I put his arm here and I pull on his arm and he doesn't let me move, this is a stable joint. Right. But if he slowly controls me down, right, that's still a stable joint because he's controlling in that presence of change. You with me? Does that make sense? In order for individual joints to be able to absorb and adapt to stress, they have to have adequate mobility and adequate stability. You with me?
Yep.
Okay.
Do you see that a lot? I mean, we've worked together on a couple things, and me coming into CrossFit and weightlifting, all that kind of stuff. It's something that you never ever really hear about is joint stabilization. You never you automatically think, at least I do, wow, I should have full mobility in my joints. Why wouldn't I have? You see that a lot with people that they lose full mobility in those joints, especially in the elbow and
we see it a ton. The body tends to have a use it or lose it policy, right? And a lot of all
the same thing with muscle then too. Right?
Yep. And so a lot of our training habits, a lot of our cultural habits tend to lend itself to us losing things that we don't use on a regular basis.
So you talk about sitting. What else are you talking
about?
Oh
yeah, again, there's no such thing as too much of this activity is bad, too much of that. Like activities, postures, all these things, they're not moral. They're not good or bad. It's just, have we built tolerances to them, right? One of the biggest issues I see, and we'll come back to that mobility and why I think we tend to see losses in mobility, is because of how people create stability. And this is one of the big things we work on with athletes a ton, both in the rehab side of the spectrum and the performance side of the spectrum. So if you look into the research, a guy named Punjabi put out research. It's been around for a long time, very solid. It's been cited a ton. But there's different ways. So the brain is in charge of creating stability, and there's different ways we can create stability, right? We can create, we go back to Nick's elbow here, right? If I go ahead and pull on his arm, right? He's creating a stable joint. He's using his muscles, right, to create stability, to prevent that joint from moving, right? This is called active stability, according to Punjabi, when we use muscles to create stability, right? But I can also have him fully extend his joint. He can stay totally relaxed, and I can press on his elbow, right? And he's still creating stability. The joint's not moving, right? But instead of using muscles, we're relying on the joint end range of motion. We're relying on the capsule, the ligaments, to also create stability here. This is called passive stability,
Right.
okay? Now, this is where most people screw up, right? Because what tends to happen is when we load a joint actively, we put ourselves in a position that we have a high tolerance to absorb and adapt into stress. When we start loading joints passively, we can manage it for a little while, but if I sit here and go like this on his elbow for a long time, he's gonna be pretty cranky with me pretty quick, right? Because his elbow's gonna hurt, because our tolerances to stress there are minimized. Now, if everything else is perfect, you can build tolerances here, right? And you can see people moving in these passively stable patterns and building tolerances to that. But our margin for error and our ability to adapt is so much better here. So again, to take it back to why athletes get hurt, a lot of times what we see is they're loading in passively stable patterns, right? And so, Nick comes to me and his elbow hurts, and like a good healthcare professional, I tell him to stop doing that, right?
Does he?
Well, sometimes they do, but oftentimes that's just a pain management solution. When we tell people you need to stop running, or you need to stop squatting, or you need to stop deadlifting, it's bad for your back. That's none of that's true, right? What we're trying to say is decrease load, okay? And so I can go from loading him in a poor position a lot to minimal loading. He's probably going to feel better. Where people get in trouble, especially as they're starting to return to performance, is they don't change that loading strategy, right? And they start loading again, what's going to happen?
Right back to it.
It's going to get right back to it, right? And so then we want to say, at his elbow, right, is he in a good position to absorb and adapt to stress? Probably not. What can we do that? Or how can we build capacity? We can change his loading strategy, right? Put him in a different or a more actively stable position, and then start slowly building capacity there, right? As we build capacity in a more actively stable position, right, typically what we'll see the injury resolve, right? Because now we're absorbing and adapting to stress. Sometimes not. Sometimes injuries do require surgery or other medical intervention, but especially with a lot of chronic orthopedic injuries, that's what we see. And then as we start building capacity here, then we can start venturing into different parts of that joint's range of motion, and then start building capacity back in those positions that he originally got hurt. And this, obviously, I'm using the elbow as an example because it's a super easy joint visually to see what I'm talking about. But all joints individually work that way, and all big major movement patterns, we look at squat patterns or gait patterns or hinging patterns, they're all managed actively or passively.
Right.
Okay, and so when we want to minimize injury, what we want to first say is, where am I failing to absorb and adapt to stress? How can I better absorb and adapt to stress, joint by joint, right? How can my feet do a better job of absorbing and adapting to stress? How can my ankles do a better job? Knees, hips, low back, mid back, et cetera, right? So we go joint by joint. Does each joint have the mobility it needs to create proper stability? Is my brain creating stability well or creating stability actively, which tends to be movement patterns, which are skills. How do we get better at skills? We practice, right? And so we practice managing loads well, or practice managing loads actively. And then what we do is as we improve that skill, what we see is we see jumps in our performance, and we see a reduction in common injuries, right? And it's obviously it's a lot more complex than that, but really it can be as simple as that too. Good training is just as rehabilitative as doing your banded exercises, if not more.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk about stabilizing load and proper stabilizing load. It seems like a big emphasis here at CrossFit Lee's Summit lately has been, and this is something that a lot of athletes don't really think about too, is learning how to brace properly on every single thing that we do, picking anything off the ground, doing a jerk overhead. Is that really kind of like one of the main stabilizing issues that you see with people, is they don't know how to brace their core properly when they're doing a lot of these movements?
Yeah, so when we look at multi-joint movements like a squat or an Olympic lift or a deadlift, right? We look at where most people fail these movements. Typically it's through the trunk. And so one of the analogies I use with athletes and patients is I tell people, as we're trying to generate force, typically your legs are your engines, right? Your trunk is your transmission, and then you express that force through the barbell or whatever implement you're using to try to move. And so oftentimes, back to the active and passive stability model that we're talking about, if we, I'm going to have you stand sideways to the, to the camera here. If we look at Nick's trunk here, he's got a full range of motion in his spine all the way from end range extension into end range flexion, right? Now, he can do different movements at both of the extreme ranges of motions there. There are some, if you look at gymnasts, right? They're
Extension, yeah.
in tons of extension all the time. Right. If you look at professional strongman lifting Atlas stones, they're in a ton of spinal flexion. You can build capacity in these positions. But you're going to be strongest and build your most robust capacity in what we would call a spinal neutral position, which tends to vary a little bit, and it's not one position, it's a range of positions. But typically what we like to see is if you lift your arm up, right? If you were to cut through and look at his anatomy here, we want to see his diaphragm mirroring his pelvic floor, and then him creating tension through his trunk in an effort to create an actively stable pattern. Oftentimes what we see with athletes is they have no kinesthetic awareness or control. Their brain doesn't know where their trunk is in space. Okay. And so then what happens is instead of, let's go back to the elbow analogy, instead of him being able to hold and manage me here, right, he just slams into that end range anyway anytime we put a load on him. And so he might be in a great position, but then we throw a 300-pound barbell on his back, and we add a ton of load, and he just slings.
Right.
You see that all the time. We're very cued out of slamming into end range spinal flexion when we deadlift because we know we herniate discs there. But one of the common faults is we get cued into end range spinal extension as a stabilizing mechanism to keep us out of end range flexion. That can cause just as many problems as well, right? And so what we need to do with these athletes in this particular example is teach them the skill or the motor pattern of creating stability well. Because what you see, especially with young athletes, right, is we can get people really strong in passively stable positions, right, or those end range positions, but then their strength tends to overdo their ability to absorb that stress, and then they end up getting hurt.
Going back to your gymnastics point, do you see a lot of athletes that prefer to be in one particular position over another? For example, do they enjoy being in extension more than flexion?
I'd say with athletes in particular, especially especially barbell athletes, most barbell athletes tend to kind of fall into this overextension position. And again, it's not being overextended in and of itself is not bad. It's when we have that position and we add load that we tend to cause problems because our capacity in this position is typically less than it is in a neutral position.
Right, because I don't walk around all day, like this.
You don't, but some people do.
I try not to, So, are there any other common, movement and stabilizing faults that you want to talk about here, or does that cover everything?
Yeah, one of the other big common faults too that we see is with the foot. All the time, you've heard the cues in the barbell world to screw your foot into the floor or spread the floor with the feet.
And that's something too, just to kind of reiterate this, it's like nobody ever really thinks about the feet, as far as being so important as they are. They're the only thing that really touches the ground.
Yeah.
For me, my first inkling is never to go to my feet for any problem I have.
Yeah.
So I always think where there's something around here or whatnot. Talk a little bit more about why that's important.
You're absolutely right, so the foot's the first point of contact, right? And what your foot does has a huge influence on what everything else does up the chain. One of the common faults that we see is we tend to see excessive overpronation or collapse of the foot. And so if I take my shoe off, I don't know if you can see my foot. What tends to happen is if you look at the anatomy of the foot, we actually have 3 arches in the foot. Okay, so we have a medial arch, we have a lateral arch, and we have a triangle arch, right? Or triangle arch, a transverse arch. And the foot is made up of this triangle of arches to create a robust, stable platform so we can absorb and adapt to stress. Oftentimes, and research isn't real clear on this, some people blame it on the shoes that we wear, the lack of moving around and lack of being barefoot.
You see those Kenyan runners, they'll run barefoot.
Yeah, absolutely. And the foot's designed to be able to absorb and adapt to stress well. Oftentimes what we see, especially as people get into adolescence and older, is the foot intrinsic muscles tend to become somewhat dysfunctional and don't create stability the way they should. And so then what happens is the foot tends to pronate and collapse in, right? And it does that, back to the stability model we were talking about, because when I load a joint, I have to create stability through that joint to prevent joint failure.
Right.
And my foot intrinsic muscles can't do that, and so I find my end range, right? Which, again, in a lot of people, looks like pronation.
Right.
We see the reverse of that, right? If somebody missteps, right, and their brain doesn't know where their foot is in space, what happens is they fall to that supinated end range, and they sprain their ankle.
That's what happens to Axeman all the time.
Well, that's what happens when you run 25 miles every day.
and you step in a hole you don't see.
And so one of the things we look at too when we see that is we can see if I pronate my foot and I load my leg, you can see my hip internally rotates, my tibia internally rotates, and I crash into knee valgus. Now, traditional strength coaching wisdom tells us this isn't an optimal position, right? Because if I squat here, my knees are going to hurt and my squat's going to not be very strong.
Probably should just put some ice on your knees.
Yes.
Yeah, that'll fix it, right?
That'll fix it. Yeah. But however, if I try to get to what we would call a subtalar neutral position or a neutral foot, some of the literature calls it a short foot. And again, everybody's anatomy is different, so it looks different for everybody. But for me, it looks like this, and I load my foot here, all of a sudden you see the knee's already corrected itself. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to worry about cues like, well, push your knees way out or whatever else, because I'm putting my joints in a position that they can not only absorb and adapt to stress, but they create better positions up the chain.
Do you think a lot of athletes have issues at the foot that they just don't know about?
I think a lot of people have issues at the foot.
Kind of an underestimated kind of
injury
point, I guess.
And for a lot of people, because we are training smart, or at least what we know about training is so much more than what we knew 10 years ago when I started practicing. That we are building capacity in it, and you see this all the time. You see people that can build high levels of capacity in poor positions, right? Because they're doing everything else right. But sometimes if we can fix those positions, we can build even further capacity because, we're improving that quality.
So let's just talk about real quickly here for everybody that's been watching. Let's do some just quick takeaways that people can use to help improve their movement patterns and hopefully avoid some injuries.
Yeah, so like we said in the beginning, injuries happen, and if you're in a sport for long enough, typically the question isn't, am I going to get injured? It's, when am I going to get injured? And so if you go into your training plan understanding that, we then, whether you're trying to prevent injury or improve performance, which is the goal of all training plans, right? We have to ask ourselves, how can we best get ourselves into positions to absorb and adapt to stress? How can we do that at each individual joint? How can I do that with global movement patterns? How can I do that with structuring my training so I am building capacity and not exceeding capacity? And then filter all of your training and what you know about injury prevention through that lens. How can I absorb and adapt to stress?
Right. Good deal. All right, well, thanks again, guys, for watching. We appreciate Mr. Jon for coming on. Thanks again, Nick, for being our demo. And if you guys like this type of content, please hit that like button so we can get this out to as many people as possible. And if you can, please hit the subscribe button. I would definitely appreciate it. Thanks again, guys.